New York City. What would you do if the very system meant to uphold justice turned against you? New York City, a city that prided itself on justice, on order, on the law. But today, in a grand courtroom filled with power players and journalists, justice felt like a distant illusion. Judge Olivia Carter sat at the defendant's table, her posture straight, her expression unreadable. Just months ago, she had stood behind the bench, delivering verdicts with precision and fairness. Today, she was the one on trial. The irony was sharp. Olivia had spent her career fighting against corruption, standing firm where others had folded. She had earned the respect of honest colleagues and the ire of those who thrived in the shadows. One of them sat across from her now, Judge Alan Whitman, a man with influence, wealth, and a reputation for making problems disappear. He had been untouchable for decades, until Olivia started exposing the cracks in his carefully constructed empire. Now he was returning the favor. The courtroom was packed. Reporters scribbled furiously, legal analysts whispered, and the public watched with eager anticipation. The case against Olivia had been carefully crafted. Misconduct, abuse of power, judicial overreach. The accusations were vague but damning enough to stain her name. A calculated move, designed to force her out quietly. Judge Whitman, presiding over her case, leaned forward. "Judge Carter, before we proceed, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Olivia met his gaze unflinching. "I've spent my entire career upholding the law, ensuring that justice is served fairly. But this," she gestured around the courtroom, "this is not justice. This is a warning to anyone who dares to challenge corruption." Whitman smirked, as if amused by her defiance. "That's quite the claim," he said, "but the evidence suggests otherwise." Olivia refused to look away. She knew how this worked. She had seen it before. They wanted her to crack, to fold under the weight of the accusations. But she had spent too many years fighting for what was right to give in now. The prosecution began its case, presenting documents, testimony, anything to frame Olivia as reckless, biased, unfit to sit on the bench. But as each piece of so-called evidence was introduced, it became clear to those paying attention this wasn't about justice. It was about silencing a threat. Outside the courthouse, protesters gathered, their voices echoing through the streets. Signs reading, "Stand with Judge Carter," waved in the air. She had supporters, people who saw through the deception, who knew that if she fell, it would only embolden those who sought to manipulate the system for their own gain. As the trial progressed, Olivia remained calm. She knew the truth. And more importantly, she knew the cost of standing up against power. What happens when dignity faces intimidation? Would you fight back when the system turns against you? The courtroom was filled with tension, a silent storm brewing beneath polished floors and marble columns. Olivia Carter sat at the defense table, her back straight, her hands clasped together. This was not the first time she had faced a challenge, but this was different. This was a setup. Just weeks ago, she had issued a ruling that sent shockwaves through the city. A wealthy developer, backed by officials with deep political ties, had attempted to seize homes from low-income families under the guise of revitalization. Olivia had seen through the scheme. She had ruled against them, protecting the residents who had nowhere else to go. And then, days later, the accusations came. Judicial bias, unethical conduct, a failure to uphold impartiality. The allegations were as vague as they were damning, carefully worded to create doubt without presenting any real evidence. And yet, the case had been fast-tracked, suspiciously so, to the one courtroom where Olivia knew the scales of justice had long been tipped. Judge Alan Whitman's. Whitman was a man who thrived on power, a judge who had built his career on crushing those who dared to challenge the establishment. He was untouchable, protected by the same elite circles Olivia had spent her career standing against. And now he sat at the bench, ready to do what he did best: erase a problem. The prosecution wasted no time, laying out their claims with a confidence that reeked of certainty. Judge Carter has repeatedly demonstrated bias in her rulings, the lead prosecutor, a slick attorney named Peter Calloway, declared. She has used her position to push personal ideology, disregarding the law in favor of activism. Olivia didn't flinch. She had expected this. Calloway continued, pacing before the jury. This court is not a place for personal crusades. It is a place for impartiality, for the law to be upheld without interference. A carefully crafted statement. It wasn't about proving Olivia had done something illegal. It was about making her look like she had. She stole a glance at Judge Whitman. He watched the proceedings with cool detachment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He didn't need to speak to make his presence known, his courtroom, his rules. And unless Olivia could turn the tide, his verdict would be a foregone conclusion. But Olivia wasn't about to back down. When it was her turn, she stood slowly, every movement deliberate. "The law exists to protect the people," she said, her voice steady, "not to serve the interests of the powerful." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scribbled furiously. Whitman's expression remained unchanged, but Olivia could see the flicker of irritation in his eyes. "I did my job," she continued. "I ruled according to the law, ensuring that citizens were not stripped of their homes for profit. And for that, I was labeled biased." She let the words hang in the air, heavy and unshakable. The jury shifted. The gallery leaned in. The truth had been spoken, but whether it would matter remained to be seen. She knew this was more than a case. This was about silencing her. Would you fight back when the system is rigged against you? The courtroom was charged with an intensity that could not be ignored. Olivia Carter sat composed, her hands folded in front of her, while Judge Alan Whitman loomed over the bench, his expression dark with manufactured authority. The gallery was packed, reporters, activists, and legal analysts eager to witness the battle that would either break Olivia or expose the corruption she had fought against for years. Judge Whitman leaned forward, his voice laced with mockery. "Miss Carter," he said, emphasizing the lack of her title, "do you understand the gravity of the charges against you?" Olivia remained seated, calm, unwavering. "I do, Your Honor. But do you understand the gravity of abusing your position?" A murmur rippled through the room. The gallery exchanged glances. Even the jury, which had been instructed to remain impartial, showed hints of unease. Whitman's face darkened. He had expected submission, not defiance. "You think I'm stupid?" he barked, slamming his gavel against the wood. The sound echoed like a gunshot through the silent chamber. Olivia met his gaze without hesitation. "I think you're afraid." The silence that followed was absolute. Reporters lowered their pens. The prosecution shifted uncomfortably. Whitman had just lost control, and everyone in the room knew it. His grip on the gavel tightened. "This is my courtroom." "No, Your Honor," Olivia said, her voice steady. "This is a court of law, and right now the law is on trial." A flicker of something, rage, uncertainty, crossed Whitman's face. He was a man used to control, used to people bending under his authority. But Olivia was not like the others. She was not afraid of him. The lead prosecutor, Peter Calloway, stood abruptly. "Your Honor, this is a clear attempt to shift focus away from the allegations. Miss Carter is not above the law." Olivia turned her gaze to Calloway. "Neither are you." Gasps spread through the crowd. Calloway's jaw tensed. "Miss Carter—" "Let's talk about the evidence," Olivia interrupted smoothly. "The so-called ethics violations, the supposed judicial bias. Where is the proof?" Calloway hesitated. "The proof is in the pattern of your rulings." "You mean the rulings where I refused to bow to corporate greed, where I upheld laws designed to protect everyday citizens?" Olivia asked, tilting her head slightly. "Or are we discussing the rulings that threatened those in power?" Whitman slammed his gavel again. "Enough!" His voice wavered slightly, betraying the cracks in his composure. "Miss Carter, you are here to answer for misconduct, not to question the legitimacy of this court." Olivia leaned forward slightly. "But that's exactly what we should be questioning, isn't it?" Her voice was quiet, yet it carried across the room with the weight of undeniable truth. The energy in the room shifted. Olivia could feel it. She had done something Whitman had not anticipated. She had forced the people watching to see the truth for themselves. For the first time in his career, Judge Alan Whitman was on the defensive. The battle was far from over, but in that moment, Olivia knew one thing for certain. She was winning. The air in the courtroom was electric, tension hanging so thick it was nearly tangible. Olivia Carter finally stood, the weight of the moment pressing down on every person in the room. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady, "I have evidence that this trial is a setup." A collective murmur rippled through the courtroom. Judge Alan Whitman's eyes narrowed, his fingers tightening around his gavel. "That's absurd," he said flatly. "This is nothing more than another attempt to deflect from your misconduct." Olivia tilted her head. "Is it?" She turned slightly, signaling her defense attorney. Across the courtroom, her attorney pressed a button on a laptop and the sound system crackled to life. A recording played. At first, it was just faint rustling, then a voice. A familiar, authoritative voice. "We can't let her win. She's dangerous." Silence. Then gasps. Reporters scribbled furiously. The jury exchanged glances, their expressions shifting from skeptical to shaken. The words hung in the air like a death sentence, not for Olivia, but for Whitman. The voice on the recording continued. "She's too ambitious. We need to make an example of her. The case is already decided." Whitman's face drained of color. Olivia took a slow step forward. "Tell me, Your Honor, should I still call you impartial?" The judge's jaw clenched, his composure slipping for the first time. "This is inadmissible." "Actually, it isn't." Olivia cut in smoothly. "This recording was obtained legally. A whistleblower who overheard the conversation provided it. And guess what? We verified the voice through forensic analysis." Another round of gasps. A ripple of unease spread through the prosecution's table, Calloway looking as if he'd just been handed his own conviction. The power dynamics in the room had shifted entirely. Judge Whitman opened his mouth, then closed it. He had lost control of the narrative, and everyone in the room knew it. Olivia turned toward the jury. "You were told that this trial was about my misconduct, that I was corrupt, biased, unfit to serve as a judge. But what you just heard, that was the voice of a man who decided the outcome before the trial even began. A man who wanted me silenced because I refused to play by his rules." Whitman's gavel came down with force. "That's enough." But it wasn't, because the truth had already been spoken. The gallery buzzed, voices rising in disbelief and outrage. Reporters typed furiously. The Rivera family, who had come seeking justice, sat motionless, absorbing what they had just heard. Whitman straightened his shoulders, attempting to reclaim his authority. "I will not allow this courtroom to become a circus," he snapped. "This trial is proceeding as scheduled." Olivia simply smiled. "Oh, I don't think so, Your Honor." She turned back to her attorney. "We're filing a motion to dismiss based on judicial corruption. And, given what we just heard, I'd say we have quite a strong case." The room erupted. Calls for recess rang out. Prosecutors whispered urgently among themselves, likely calculating how quickly they could distance themselves from Whitman. The jury sat in stunned silence, processing the fact that they had nearly been pawns in a game of power and control. Whitman sat frozen, knowing this was more than just a challenge to his authority. This was the beginning of his downfall. The power in the room had shifted. And now, the real fight for justice had begun. The courtroom was no longer under Judge Alan Whitman's control. The carefully constructed walls of his authority were cracking, and Olivia Carter was watching it happen in real time. Whitman's face turned red, his fingers curling around the edges of his bench, as if gripping onto the last remnants of his power. "That recording proves nothing," he spat, his voice strained. Olivia didn't flinch. "It proves everything," she countered, her words slicing through the silence. She turned to her attorney, who placed a stack of documents on the evidence table. "And there's more." The gallery leaned forward, the air thick with anticipation. Reporters had stopped writing, their eyes glued to the scene unfolding before them. The jury, still reeling from the audio evidence, now faced tangible proof, pages upon pages of backdoor deals, financial transactions, bribes, and records of judicial favoritism, all tied to Whitman's name. Whitman's expression shifted from rage to something closer to panic. He shot up from his chair. "This is outrageous, a blatant attack on the integrity of this court." Olivia tilted her head. "Is it, or is it just the truth?" The prosecutor, Peter Calloway, sat motionless, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as if he were grinding his teeth into dust. His case had crumbled in a matter of minutes. He had backed the wrong side, and now he was frozen in the wreckage. The jury exchanged uneasy glances. They had been presented with two versions of reality, one dictated by authority, the other by undeniable fact. And now, with every revelation, the choice between them became clearer. Whitman's hands slammed against his bench. "This is a disgrace. I am the presiding judge in this case. You will not intimidate this courtroom any longer." Olivia's voice, steady as ever, cut through his tantrum. The silence that followed was deafening. Judge Whitman, a man used to commanding every room he entered, suddenly found himself powerless. His reputation, built on intimidation and quiet corruption, was disintegrating before his eyes. The lead defense attorney turned to Olivia, clearing his throat. "Your Honor!" Whitman whipped around. "I am the only judge in this courtroom." "Not for long," Olivia replied smoothly, "because after today, I think it's safe to say you'll be facing an inquiry of your own." Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The journalists knew what this meant. This was bigger than Olivia's case now. This was about the entire system that had protected men like Whitman for years. One of the jurors, a middle-aged woman who had remained silent throughout the trial, shifted in her seat. She turned to her fellow jurors, and for the first time, Whitman noticed what was happening. They weren't looking at Olivia anymore. They were looking at him. His pulse pounded in his ears. "This is my courtroom," he shouted, but the words carried no weight. No authority, just desperation. The bailiffs stood in position, awaiting the next move. Calloway ran a hand down his face, realizing his career might just be collateral damage in Whitman's downfall. Olivia took a deep breath. "Your Honor," she said, "I motion for this case to be dismissed with prejudice." Whitman didn't respond. He couldn't, because for the first time he wasn't the one in control. And that's when everything changed. The courtroom was packed. The tension so thick it was suffocating. Every seat was filled, every eye locked on the jury box, where 12 men and women held the fate of 2 judges in their hands. Olivia Carter sat at the defense table, her hands folded in her lap, her expression calm despite the storm around her. Across from her, Judge Alan Whitman sat rigid, his jaw clenched so tightly that his face was nearly crimson. The presiding judge cleared his throat. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" The jury foreperson, a composed woman in her 50s, stood. "We have, Your Honor." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery. The Rivera family, who had watched this case unfold with heavy hearts, clutched one another's hands. Reporters prepared for what could be the most shocking verdict of the year. Whitman's supporters sat stiffly, their confidence wavering. The judge nodded. "Please read the verdict." The foreperson unfolded the paper in her hands, her voice steady but firm. "On the charge of judicial misconduct, we find the defendant, Judge Olivia Carter, not guilty." A wave of relief crashed over the courtroom. The gallery erupted in cheers. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, cameras flashing. Olivia exhaled deeply, closing her eyes for a brief second before opening them again, her shoulders lighter than they had been in weeks. Whitman, however, sat frozen. He had been so certain, so sure that his influence, his connections, would secure Olivia's downfall. But now, the ground beneath him was crumbling. The presiding judge lifted a hand for silence, and the courtroom slowly settled. "Continue." The jury foreperson cleared her throat. "On the charge of abuse of power, we find Judge Alan Whitman guilty." The silence that followed was deafening. A sharp inhale could be heard from Whitman's defense table. His attorneys sat motionless, their carefully curated arguments now meaningless. A collective gasp swept through the room. Whitman's grip on the armrests of his chair tightened. "This is outrageous," he finally bellowed, his voice cracking. "I demand an appeal. This is a sham trial." The presiding judge ignored his outburst. "Judge Alan Whitman, you have been found guilty by a jury of your peers. You will be formally sentenced in a later hearing. Until then, you will be remanded into custody." Bailiffs moved forward, but Whitman shot up from his seat. "You can't do this. I built this system. I own this courtroom." His face was red, his composure long gone. "You'll regret this, every single one of you." No one responded. Olivia watched the moment unfold, but she felt no satisfaction. There was no joy in seeing a corrupt man fall, only the knowledge that for once justice had prevailed. She turned to the Rivera family, whose eyes were filled with tears, not just of grief, but of vindication. Outside, crowds had gathered in anticipation of the verdict. The doors swung open, and a cheer erupted from the streets. Signs demanding accountability and fairness waved high in the air. Reporters rushed to Olivia as she stepped outside, microphones shoved toward her. "Judge Carter, what does this verdict mean for the future of the justice system?" She took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the crowd. "It means that no one is above the law, not even the powerful." But what happened next stunned everyone. The courthouse doors swung open, and Olivia Carter stepped outside into the bright glare of flashing cameras. The roar of the crowd was deafening. Supporters cheered, protesters chanted, and reporters pushed forward, microphones thrust toward her. The case was over. The verdict had been delivered, but the battle for justice was far from finished. "Judge Carter, what's next for you?" a journalist called out, struggling to be heard over the commotion. Olivia paused for a moment, her gaze sweeping over the sea of faces. Some were filled with relief, others with expectation. This case had never been just about her. It was about a system that had long protected the powerful at the expense of the vulnerable. It was about proving that change was possible. She smiled, standing tall. Justice. The simple word sent another wave of cheers through the crowd. Cameras clicked furiously, capturing the image of a woman who had faced down corruption and won. The Kingsleys of the world had always assumed people like her could be silenced, erased. But the truth had been louder. That night, Olivia didn't go home to celebrate in solitude. Instead, she returned to the heart of the community she had fought to protect. A small gathering awaited her at the local law school, where young students sat eagerly, waiting to hear from the woman who had just shaken the very foundation of the justice system. She stepped onto the modest stage, the warmth of familiar faces grounding her. "They tried to silence me," she began, her voice steady, filled with conviction. "But the truth is louder." A hush fell over the room. These students weren't just here to listen. They were here to learn, to understand how someone could stand against power and still come out on the other side. "The system isn't perfect," Olivia admitted. "Far from it. But today it listened, and tomorrow we make sure it listens again, and the day after that, and the day after that, until justice isn't a privilege, it's a guarantee." Applause erupted. Some students had tears in their eyes, knowing they were witnessing history. For so long, they had been told that real change was impossible, that fighting the system would only lead to failure. But Olivia had proven otherwise. Meanwhile, across the city, the aftermath of the trial rippled through legal circles. Whitman's allies scrambled, distancing themselves from him. The courts, now under scrutiny, were being forced to examine long-buried cases of corruption. Olivia had set something in motion that could not be undone. And as she left the law school that night, stepping into the cool air of the city she had sworn to protect, she knew one thing for certain. She had won a case that day. But in the end, she had changed the system forever. Would you have done what Olivia did? Share this story if you believe in standing up for justice.